Hey everyone, welcome back to Infinite Podcast. I'm here with Simon, and today we're diving into the origins of alienation. We're talking about those moments in history where big decisions by the powers that be just didn't vibe with what people wanted. Think prohibition or some bold civil rights moves. It's fascinating how these choices seem to alienate the very folks they were meant to serve. Right, Simon? What's your take on this disconnection starting from something like prohibition?
Oh, prohibition. Now that was a wild time, wasn't it? Imagine the government saying, no more booze for you, and everyone's just sneaking around, brewing moonshine in bathtubs. It's like telling me I can't have my morning coffee. Absolute chaos. It's one of those classic examples where you scratch your head and wonder who thought this would pan out without a hitch. It just pushed people to want what they couldn't have even more.
Yeah, right? It's like, who really thought cutting off everyone's booze supply wouldn't cause some major uproar? Makes you wonder if they were really out of touch or just trying something bold that backfired. And speaking of backfiring, do you think there was a moment they realized, uh-oh, this isn't working?
Oh, absolutely. It must have been like that moment when you accidentally text the wrong person and then realized, uh-oh, can't take that back. They probably saw the speakeasies popping up like mushrooms after rain, folks smuggling hooch left and right, and just big collective eye-rolling at the law. What a facepalm moment for those policymakers. Like, were they so out of touch thinking suddenly everyone would just nod and turn into tea sippers? Nope.
Uh, yeah, and the thing is, Simon, it's not just about folks wanting their drinks. The whole prohibition saga kind of opened up a can of worms regarding trust between the public and the government. If you think about it, pushing such a drastic change without enough public backing was sort of naive. It set a precedent that maybe the top dogs didn't always have the average Joe's interests at heart. Makes you question, were any lessons learned, or are we seeing repeats of this in other policies?
Oh man, that reminds me of this time. Back in school, we had this rule suddenly pop up where no snacks were allowed during class. Out of nowhere, right? Just like prohibition, they thought it'd make us more attentive or something. But what happened instead was kids smuggling candy bars in their socks. Yeah, seriously. The trust between students and faculty just plummeted because we felt they weren't, like, really looking out for us, but rather laying down random rules. It showed how top-down decisions can really miss the mark if there's no vibe check with the people affected. So yeah, when I see governments do similar things now, I'm like, have you not learned anything from history or high school snack bans?
Totally, Simon. It's like they say history repeats itself, and man, does it ever. Just goes to show you can't sneak policies past the people. They always find their candy bars, or in Prohibition's case, their hidden speakeasies, right? Reminds me of that old joke, Prohibition made more old ladies into sudden criminals than cops knew what to do with. Grandma's famous lemonade wasn't just for sipping, if you catch my drift. But seriously, every time there's a top-down decision that skips the pulse of the populace, it's like school all over again. Did anyone really think high schoolers would give up snacks quietly or citizens would just nod along to drastic changes? Nah, not happening.
Haha, right? It's just wild how history gives us clear lessons. Take the civil rights era, for instance. Big policies, but often lacking the full support of society at the moment. The government sanctioned civil rights initiatives that were crucial, yep, very much needed, but they pushed hard and fast, which polarized folks more than a debate over pineapple on pizza. Then you flip the script to economic policy, like when folks were loving the Roaring Twenties and then smacked straight into the Great Depression. The New Deal was introduced, right? Radical changes again, big government stepping in, trying to stir the pot, fix things up. Key moments where people felt the disconnection because the communication just wasn't there. They're suddenly seeing Big Brother intervene without feeling like they got a seat at the table. It feels kinda like being on an episode of a prank reality show, doesn't it? Surprise! Here's what we're doing for you. Except the surprises aren't always pleasant, are they?
Yeah, it's like everyone's playing a massive game of Monopoly but didn't get the rule book. You think you're just passing go, collecting $200, and then bam, rules change. No warning. Makes you wonder how different things could be with just a bit more chit-chat between the big shots and the folks on the ground, huh?
Absolutely, Joe. Like, imagine if the big shots actually sat down and had a real talk with people before just flipping the Monopoly board. I mean, isn't that such a no-brainer? Take something like the space race, right? We're shooting rockets off left and right, trying to beat everyone to the moon. But back on Earth, folks were rallying for basic rights and economic stability. Makes you think, what if they spread that space budget into neighborhoods, into schools? Sure, the moon's cool, but you gotta keep your backyard happy first. Don't you think having those conversations, actually looping in the public on what's gonna benefit them directly, could have changed the feeling of alienation that was brewing around then? What's the point of footprints on the moon if people feel walked all over back home, right?
Yeah, Simon, that totally reminds me of this one time back in my neighborhood. There was a big fuss about building this huge new park. Everyone was hyped, right? Uh, Promotions were all glitzy, showed these lush green spaces, playgrounds, the works. But then, midway through, funds got diverted to some fancy high-rise projects nearby, completely different from what everyone expected. People felt super blindsided, like their voices just kind of evaporated after the initial buy-in. It's like they promised us Central Park, and we ended up with just a bench and a couple of trees. Makes you think, if only there'd been more of those sit-downs, open conversations throughout the project, maybe there wouldn't have felt such a disconnect, huh? Kind of shows on a smaller scale how much those big decisions can feel alienating when folks aren't kept in the loop, right?
Oh, for sure. And this isn't just us rambling. There's some real substance to this discussion of alienation caused by top-down decision-making. Take Robert Putnam's theory in his book Bowling Alone. He talks about the decline in social capital, trust, networks, norms of reciprocity, which directly ties back to people feeling disconnected from both their community and larger policy decisions. Historically, when projects or policies are pushed without public inclusion, trust erodes. Just think about urban renewal programs in the 50s and 60s, like the Cross Bronx Expressway in New York. They promised rejuvenation but ended up displacing thousands of residents and fracturing communities, leading to years, even generations, of mistrust in local governance. It's a textbook example of what happens when those at the top don't genuinely engage with the needs and voices of the everyday folks. The park fiasco in your neighborhood? It's just a miniature version of such historical blunders where the disconnect wasn't just inconvenient, it was downright destructive.
Oh, that's brutally spot on, Simon. It's like every time leaders make these moves without peeking over their ivory towers, they're accidentally planting seeds for a future trust drought. If we flip this script, imagine the power of doing the opposite, actually tuning in and turning up community voices rather than tuning them out. Could completely rewrite the playbook on public trust, huh?
Oh, totally, Joe. It's like switching from silent films to surround sound. Suddenly, everyone's part of the story, not just spectators. Could lead to some epic plot twists in our society's script.
Absolutely, Simon. Stepping up to stereo sound gives everyone a chance to not just hear, but be heard too, right? Thinking about origins of alienation, it's clear there are layers to this we've only just scratched. There's a whole narrative filled with lessons on engagement and trust just waiting to be unpacked deeper. For all you listeners grappling with these themes in your neighborhoods or noticing patterns in history, what's your take? How does the script need changing?
Joe, this whole chat about community engagement and public policy, it makes me think about the bigger machine behind all these decisions, bureaucracy. There's this constant tug of war between keeping things orderly and actually listening to what folks want. It's like bureaucracy tries to keep the train on the tracks, but sometimes you gotta wonder if it remembers to pick up the passengers along the way, right?
Yeah, Simon. It's like bureaucracy has its own GPS set to the most convoluted route possible and forgets to check if anyone in the car even wants to go that way. I mean, think about it. There's this whole iron triangle deal, lobbyists, bureaucracies, and committees, all snug in their comfort zone, while the average Joe's voice gets muffled under layers of red tape. It's wild, really. Does that structure inevitably stray from the very democratic ideals it's supposed to support? Kind of makes you wonder if there's a better way to run the show without leaving folks feeling sidelined.
Uh, yeah, it seriously does make you wonder. This whole system, sometimes it feels like it's just chugging along its predetermined path without looking left or right. Like, imagine you're trying to speak up, but every time you do, there's another form to fill out or a new rule that pops up out of nowhere. It's frustrating, man. Honestly, Joe, it gets me kind of heated because it's not just about inefficiency or delays, it's about real people getting lost in the fray. We've got to find a way to simplify this beast. Make sure that doing things by the book doesn't mean ignoring the cries and whispers of everyday folks who are supposed to be benefiting from this whole democracy gig, right?
Oh, totally, Simon. It's like bureaucracy's got this manual, a thick one, and every time there's a hiccup or someone raises a voice, the default is to turn another page in that manual instead of actually listening. I get it, systems need rules to function, but when the paperwork becomes more important than the people, we've got to step back and look at what we're sacrificing on the altar of efficiency. Like, isn't democracy all about giving power to the people? So if bureaucracy constantly complicates things to the point where people feel disconnected, aren't we missing the whole point of why we set up these systems in the first place? It's a tricky balance for sure, but leaning too much into bureaucracy without checks feels like a slow drift from the democratic ideal, huh?
Oh, for sure, Joe. It really hits the nail on the head. Haha, speaking of a sacrifice on the altar of efficiency, this reminds me of this hilarious but kind of tragic thing that happened in my town. So they introduced this new waste management system, right? Super advanced, very snazzy, all automated and whatnot. The idea was great on paper. Streamline trash collection, cut costs, sweeten the deal for everyone. But man, the rollout was a mess. They had these new bins that were supposed to be bear-proof or something. Because, our town has like a bear or two wandering around every now and then. But here's the kicker. They didn't fit in the older garages and lanes. Residents started calling in, trying to find out what to do because they couldn't use these Hulk-sized bins. The answer? Oh, it's rich. Just rearrange your structures to accommodate the bins. Like, who says that? It just showed how detached the planners were from the actual lives of the people there. It's not just about adding a fancy new system. It's about understanding how folks live day to day. That manual Joe mentioned, it totally skipped the chapter on real-world application. So much for democracy in action. If you can't throw out your trash without remodeling your house, where's the vote in that, right?
Ha, right, Simon? It's like they handed everyone a magic wand thinking it'd solve all problems. In reality, turned into oversized rolling pins. Makes you think, what other daily solutions are more about ticking boxes than actually making life easier?
Oh boy, don't even get me started on smart devices that seem to have more smarts than usability. Ever tried setting one of those up? It's like decoding the Enigma machine.
Ha, exactly, Simon. It's supposed to make your life easier, but instead, you end up needing a PhD in tech just to turn on your coffee maker. Like, why am I wrestling with Wi-Fi settings at 7 a.m.? Just give me my caffeine fix without the tech quiz.
Oh, exactly, Joe. And, you know what's crazier? It's like these gadgets and systems, they claim to simplify life, right? But they almost always end up adding another layer of complexity. And isn't that just a snapshot of the larger issue we're tackling? This whole bureaucracy versus democracy tangle? It's funny how every new improvement in government or tech feels like it needs an instruction manual fit for rocket scientists. The irony is, you need a framework to manage the frameworks. Seems almost like, by trying to fine-tune democracy with these complex bureaucratic layers, we might actually be steering away from its core principle, simplicity and empowerment. So, like, should we push for a democracy reboot or something? Strip it back to basics where people don't feel shut out by their own system's rulebook.
Simon hitting the reboot on democracy sounds radical, but it might not be far off base. Let's unpack that with some facts. Historically, bureaucracy was designed to execute the will of political entities, inherently making it a tool of administration rather than a driver of democratic engagement. Take Weber's concept of bureaucracy. It emphasizes efficiency, predictability, specialization, and non-personal orientations which undeniably resist change and can be restrictive by nature. That rigidity tends to support the status quo rather than embrace the dynamic changes driven by democratic will. Then, look at voter turnout as an indicator. In places with high bureaucratic hurdles, like complex registration laws, turnout often dips. It suggests that complex systems can deter democratic participation directly. Plus, studies indicate high levels of bureaucratic complexity can erode trust in governance, fueling disconnection and dissatisfaction. This disillusion isn't just theoretical, it's palpable and measurable. So if we're talking framework, maybe what democracy needs isn't more layers but clearer windows. Like simplifying the interaction between citizen and state could restore some of that foundational intent. Power to the people, not over the people, right?
Oh, crystal clear windows instead of bureaucratic brick walls. Now that's a renovation project worth investing in. Who's ready to swing the first sledgehammer?
Yeah, Simon, count me in. Swinging sledgehammers at those walls might just be the wake-up call needed. So talking about making changes and updating systems, do you think focusing more on technological solutions could simplify these interactions? Or would that just add another layer of complexity to an already stacked deck? What's your take on blending tech with democracy?
Oh, Joe, mixing tech with democracy? That's like putting a raccoon in charge of garbage management. Sure, it sounds good on paper, modern, innovative, but next time you check, everything's everywhere, and the raccoon's just hitting likes on trash talk.
Ha, trash talk. Classic, Simon. Yeah, tech can be a double-edged sword. Offers fixes, but also throws in new kinks. It's a tightrope walk, this whole bureaucracy versus democracy thing, huh? Maybe it's about finding the right balance where tech supports, not overruns, the democratic process. There's a lot to unpack there. Could be something we dive deeper into next time.
You know, Joe, talking about bureaucracy and tech kind of makes me think about those times when the folks in charge, like the lawmakers, really misread what people need or want. It's almost like watching someone trying to push a pull door. It's just not going to work, no matter how hard they try. Brings us to those hilarious, yet sometimes facepalm-worthy blunders in legislation. Oh man, there have been some real doozies out there.
Oh, for sure, Simon. It's like they're crafting these laws in a vacuum, totally disconnected from what's happening on the ground. Like that time, I think it was Ohio, they passed a law banning fish from being used in drinking contests. Pretty specific, right? Makes you wonder who thought, yes, this is exactly what our citizens need protection from. And then there's the classic ones like it's still being illegal to carry an ice cream cone in your back pocket in some places. Really shows how some laws just don't age well or make much sense even when they were made. What's been your favorite "what were they thinking" moment in legislation, Simon?
Absolutely, Joe. These laws, you just gotta wonder how they even got passed. Like my favorite, it's gotta be this weird law. I'm not making this up. It was actually illegal to wear a fake mustache in church because it could cause laughter. Can you imagine? Sitting there trying to keep a straight face while someone's got a big old cartoonish mustache flopping around during hymns. It's like legislation sometimes misses the mark so wildly that you gotta ask, who are these laws really for? Have you come across any other standout examples of laws that had you scratching your head, wondering what the lawmakers were smoking at the time?
Oh yeah, Simon, it's a riot thinking about these laws. Plenty of examples where you just go, huh? Take Alabama, for instance, where until recently it was illegal to carry an ice cream cone in your back pocket. If that's not legislating against phantom problems, I don't know what is. And let's not forget the whole saga around jaywalking laws in the U.S., originally pushed by auto manufacturers to shift street control from pedestrians to vehicles, shaping city layouts and public space usage significantly. Talk about hidden agendas. Another standout has got to be the UK's old TV detector van law, claiming vans could detect the operation of a television inside homes to enforce licensing fees. raised big questions on privacy and whether those vans did anything at all. These cases underline how laws can sometimes serve very narrow interests or arise from outdated concerns, risking public disconnect or outright mockery. They show us essentially why keeping legislation in sync with current societal norms and values isn't just good policy. It's crucial to maintain public trust and efficacy.
Oh, absolutely, Joe. It's like some of these laws are more about catching Bigfoot, lots of effort for something that doesn't really exist. Got to remember, though, every odd law started as a seemingly good idea in someone's head.
That's a spot-on take, Simon. It's fascinating how these laws even get through. Kind of makes you think about the checks and balances, right? We've seen some amusing stuff, but it also sheds light on larger issues of disconnect between lawmakers and the public they serve. Kind of emphasizes the need for more practical, grounded discussions in legislative halls. And what about feedback loops? Like ensuring there's a mechanism for regular review and phasing out laws that no longer serve their purpose or align with modern values. That might prevent some of these more laughable bits of legislation from hanging around too long. Keeping a law book updated might just be as critical as making new laws, don't you think?
Uh, yeah, Joe, I get where you're coming from with the whole update the law book idea. Like, totally makes sense on paper. But then you think about how slow this machine works. It's like watching paint dry. So when we talk about these feedback loops and making laws reflect modern values, we're also slamming into that old bureaucratic red tape. It's kind of like, are we just sticking band-aids on a wooden leg? The system's sluggish, man. Makes me wonder if what we really need is not just updating laws, but a complete overhaul of how laws are made and reviewed. Like, imagine if lawmakers had to actually live with the laws they pass in some trial phase. Bet we'd see some rapid changes then.
Absolutely, Simon. Putting lawmakers in the hot seat to experience their own legislation firsthand, that would be something. Imagine the insights and rapid shifts we'd see then. It's all about making that legislative process more responsive, less of a relic. We could chat forever on how to streamline this ancient gearbox. Definitely something we should dive deeper into next time, huh? Keeps reminding us why understanding these blunders is not just funny, it's crucial. How else do you think we could shake things up in legalese land, Simon?
Speaking of making systems work better, Joe, it kind of loops back to how much people actually know about how these systems are supposed to work in the first place. Like there's this big old gap between what's going down in the government and what Joe Public thinks is happening. Digging into that, don't you think boosting civic education could be a game changer here?
Definitely, Simon. Spot on there. It's like most folks are playing a game, but they never got the rule book, right? Increasing civic education sounds like a solid move to help bridge that gap. It could really empower individuals, give them a clearer grasp of how decisions are made. For instance, take Scandinavian countries. They often rank high in civic engagement because they invest heavily in educating their people about civic duties from a young age. Citizens are not just aware but involved. They discuss, debate, and understand policy impacts more deeply. So yeah, boosting that kind of education could transform voter engagement over here too. Imagine if everyone truly understood the inner workings. Wouldn't that push for more accountability from our leaders? What do you think, man? Does that line up with your thoughts?
Yeah, Joe. The Scandinavian example is pretty killer. But, like, you gotta wonder, right? Is it just about dumping more info on people, or do we need to get them genuinely juiced about being involved too? Because, let's face it, just knowing stuff doesn't automatically mean you're gonna jump up and do something with that knowledge. Like in the US, we've got civics in the classroom, sure, but how many come out feeling fired up to use what they've learned? It often falls flat. So maybe the real trick is not just bulking up what we teach, but flipping the whole script. Make it engaging, make it hit home why it matters personally, you know? And while I hear you about accountability, boosting education might light up some folks, but others might still shy away from getting hands-on. Got any thoughts on making civics less like eating your veggies because it's good for you and more like something everyone actually wants to get in on?
You're hitting the nail right on the head, Simon. Uh, the problem might lie in the traditional dry methods we usually see with civic education. It's often not engaging or relatable enough. Switching up those methods could definitely kindle more interest. Consider how stories impact us. If those civics classes used more real-world scenarios, like debates on current events or community-led projects, they'd resonate better. It shifts from abstract policies to things that touch everyday lives directly. Or look at gamification. Injecting elements like points for participation or interactive platforms might jazz it up. In Taiwan, they've embraced digital tools to couple civic education with technology, fostering online discussions that have led to real legislative changes. This model emphasizes interaction over memorization, setting a tangible link between learning about government and influencing it. So yeah, switching the focus to active personal engagement, not just making civics mandatory, could really change the game and make people feel like they're part of the democracy they live in, not just subjects of it. What's your take on mixing up the approach, Simon?
Oh, absolutely, Joe. The Taiwan example? Total game changer. Makes civics more like a multiplayer online battle, a real team effort rather than a solo slog through a textbook. Plus, who doesn't love a bit of tech making things spicier, right? It's making learning about government actually feel modern and, less about dusty old dudes in wigs. Could really crank up the whole engagement engine if we took that route more seriously here.
Absolutely, Simon. Imagine teaming that up with VR simulations where students could virtually sit in on Congress sessions or take part and vote on mock bills. It'd be like bringing the thrill of video games into learning about government. Talk about a way to fire up the next generation's interest in politics.
Oh man, Joe, diving into VR Congress sessions? That's straight up epic. Imagine flipping on your headset and bam, you're smack in the middle of a major policy debate. Makes learning about civic duties totally electrifying. It's ideas like these that could seriously revamp how we think about educating our future voters and leaders. What a wild ride that would be. Got any more of those futuristic vibes in mind for civics?
Absolutely, Simon. Harnessing tech could revitalize how younger generations engage with politics. Speaking of engagement, it's intriguing to see how different types of political movements gain traction, like populism. Across continents, populist leaders tap into folks' deepest concerns and frustrations, whether economic, social, or political. It really shows the power of feeling heard and represented. How do you think this ties back to our earlier discussion on civic education?
Well, Joe, here's the thing. While civic education definitely helps folks understand political mechanics and all, it doesn't necessarily cure the itch that populism scratches, you know? Populism gets its fuel from real deep-seated frustrations where people feel ignored or left behind by the mainstream parties. That's why these leaders who come in waving the populist banner can seem so appealing. They promise quick fixes, simple answers to complex problems. And let's be honest, sometimes more education about how politics is supposed to work just highlights how messed up things are. It might even push people towards those populist options faster because they see just how slowly the usual routes affect change. It's like, great, I know how a bill becomes a law, but why isn't anyone actually listening? So, while I'm all for buffing up civics classes, we gotta recognize it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Plus, some folks are gonna see through what they think of as just more system tools, trying to shape their opinions. They want voices that sound like theirs, not what textbooks say they should hear.
You're nailing a crucial point there, Simon. Populism thrives on that immediate connection with voters' issues, often outpacing traditional political methods in its appeal. It taps into that raw emotion and frustration at being overlooked by the usual electoral mechanics. Diving deeper into this, they often promise to shake things up, which is tempting when you feel stuck or silenced. And considering that, how do we reconcile the rise of populist leaders with the potential benefits of robust civic education? Like, can we design educational strategies that not only inform, but also empower individuals without falling into the trap of oversimplifying complex issues like these populists do? What's your take on finding that balance, Simon?
Joe, That's the million-dollar question, right? It's like trying to balance on a tightrope while juggling hot potatoes. We need education that not only puts out facts, but also teaches critical thinking. Show folks how to sniff out oversimplification and resist those flashy promises that don't have solid ground underneath. Could civic tech be the hero we're looking for here, blending engagement with deep understanding? What if teaching politics felt as dynamic as following a riveting TV series or being part of a community project? Just imagine the possibilities.
Right, Simon. Imagine flipping the whole script so politics isn't just something you watch or complain about from the sidelines, but it's actually as immersive and addictive as your favorite binge-worthy show. Dive in, get your hands dirty, and truly impact what happens next. Turn passive spectators into active participants. What a profound shift that would be. How do we make that first step towards this transformation, Simon?
Yeah, Joe, making politics addictive. It's a solid plan. But, flipping the script ain't no small ask. First step, we gotta tackle the portrayal of politics. As it stands, it's often seen as this distant behemoth that's way out of touch with the daily grind, right? Maybe start by zooming in on those local issues that fire people up. Connect bigger politics to everyday lives. And then we can't just paint all populist movements with the same brush. Like, populists in one place might be pushing policies totally different from another continent's cheer squad. So if we're teaching this stuff, we need stories, real examples that show why folks turn to these leaders. It's not just economic frustration or social fears, but a deep craving for recognition and respect. Making that connection might just make political engagement as exciting as figuring out who gets voted off the island next.
You're spot on there, Simon. Zooming in on those local issues can really show how big politics directly impacts our day-to-day lives. Making it relatable is key, but also showing the diversity within populist movements is super crucial to understanding their broad appeal. So like diving deeper, with all these different flavors of populism around the globe, how do we ensure that this educational approach doesn't oversimplify? How do we respect the complexity while still making it digestible and engaging for everyone? What are your thoughts on that balance, Simon?
Oh, Joe, you're asking me to cook a gourmet meal, but only in a microwave, huh? Trying to keep everyone engaged without losing the spice. Man, it's like trying to explain quantum physics using nothing but emojis. We gotta keep it snappy yet saucy. Remind folks, politics isn't just your grandma's old soap opera. It's more like reality TV with real stakes. Now, that's a season finale worth waiting for.
Whoa, Simon, that's a heck of an analogy right there. Like using reality TV as a model? That's pretty out there, but totally makes sense when you think about it. Populism really does feel like it's about the intense drama, those personal stories, and high stakes. Let's break it down some more. You got any specific thoughts on how this reality show approach could actually play out in educating people about political movements? How do we frame these global narratives to keep them hooked, episode after episode?
Totally, Joe. Tapping into that reality TV vibe means making each lesson feel like a cliffhanger. Keep them guessing, keep them engaged. We could slice up those complex political narratives into digestible episodes, right? Each one dives into different populist movements with the juicy drama of real-world implications. And let's not shy away from the messy bits. They're what gets people talking, after all. Can you imagine next week diving deeper into how these stories vary wildly but connect universally? How might discussing these contrasts reveal more about why populism rings true for so many globally?
For sure, Simon. Diving into the contrasts and varied approaches can reveal a lot. Speaking of real-world implications, it's crucial to look at how these populist movements actually reshape policies once they're in power. For example, taking a closer look at recent populist governments, seeing their policy reforms up close. How do you think these charismatic leaders are directly influencing public opinion and ultimately policymaking? Let's unpack that a bit more.
Joe, it's tempting to think these charismatic leaders are like puppet masters pulling all the strings. But we gotta consider, maybe it's not just about them. Like their power seriously depends on people actually buying into what they're selling. So if we flip this around a bit, Some might argue that charisma isn't shaping policy as much as it's amplifying existing public sentiments. Leaders might be more like mirrors, reflecting what folks are already feeling rather than dictating those feelings. This means those big policy shifts, they aren't just pulled out of thin air by one charming leader. They're possibly responses to deeper currents in society that these figures are just tapping into. It's kind of like how a surfer doesn't create the wave but knows how to ride it. Know what I mean, Joe?
Yeah, Simon, that's a spot-on point about these leaders reflecting public sentiment rather than strictly forming it. It's like they're not the creators of the wave, but excellent surfers, as you said. If we dive a bit deeper into those policy shifts, they often seem sudden, but they're really built on pre-existing sentiments, right? It's fascinating to consider how deeply this impacts international relations, too. When a country makes a populist turn, it isn't just internally they feel the ripples, but it sends waves across global policies and alliances, too. So the question becomes, how do nations manage these shifts while keeping up with international expectations and obligations?
Yeah, Joe, that's the tricky part, isn't it? Nations kind of have to walk this tightrope between popular domestic demands and, keeping up good relations internationally. When a country zigs into populism, it thinks it's solving stuff at home, but it might be zagging away from international norms. So, consider this. Sometimes these shifts cause friction with allies who see things, well, more traditionally. Countries aren't islands, right? Even if they sort of act like it during populist waves. They got to juggle keeping folks at home happy while not freaking out their neighbors and partners abroad. And let's be real, that balancing act, it can get messier than a toddler eating spaghetti. How do you see countries managing or struggling to manage this balancing dilemma, Joe?
Well, Simon, it's a high-stakes game for sure. Take a look at the UK with Brexit, the decision largely driven by populist sentiments that promised returning control and sovereignty to British hands, gravely affected their relationships, especially with the EU, impacting everything from trade to migration. Then there's Brazil under Bolsonaro, where his approach shifted environmental policies drastically. His government weakened regulations protecting the Amazon, which spiked concerns globally about climate change impacts. Even in the US, Trump's presidency saw significant shifts like pulling out of international agreements such as the Paris Climate Accord and questioning NATO commitments, all stirring substantial international reactions. Each of these cases shows how domestic populism can put international relations on a tightrope, challenging global cooperation norms and pushing countries to reconsider long-standing alliances and strategies. How do we think nations will adapt moving forward, navigating this populist influence while keeping the global stage in mind?
Oh, Joe, navigating that is like playing 3D chess on a roller coaster. Super complex and always moving. As these nations zigzag through populism, maybe we'll see an even bigger shift towards regional alliances or countries tweaking their foreign policies to charm similar populist regimes. It's going to be wild watching this all unfold, don't you think? What's the next sharp turn you're expecting on this global roller coaster, Joe?
Absolutely, Simon. It's like every country is spinning their own political kaleidoscope. I'm curious if we'll see some nations pivot back towards traditional governance structures as a reaction to the chaos, kind of like a political detox after too much fast food. What do you think? Could this push for more stable, predictable policies be the next turn in the saga?
Maybe, Joe, but think about it. Would that really be the course? Stability sounds nice on paper, right? But the flavor of the month seems to often be chaos. After getting a taste for dramatic, headline-making politics, folks might find the old school stuff a bit bland, don't you think? Like going from spicy taco to plain oatmeal. Plus, there's this whole idea of political identity that people have chewed up and bought into. Can leaders just shove that back in the box? I'm skeptical, man. People might just continue craving those big, bold moves instead of settling for what they might see as predictable policies. What's your take, Joe? Could the push for exciting and unpredictable potentially hem us into this dynamic long term?
Oh, Simon, you're hitting the nail on the head. This craving for drama, does redefine political norms. If we look at other examples around the globe, like Hungary under Orban or Turkey under Erdogan, these populist movements have cemented long-term changes in governance that favor strong, centralized power and often sideline traditional democratic checks and balances. Now these actions can deeply influence sectors from judicial reforms to press freedoms, rolling back decades of progress in a few years. In Hungary, for instance, media consolidation has led to most information outlets echoing government sentiments. Barely any critical voices left. Over in Turkey, sweeping purges in the civil service, judiciary, and education post-coup attempt have reshaped societal structures significantly. So yeah, it's more than just a flavor change. It's a deep-seated shift in how politics interacts with every facet of society. This roller coaster might just be the new normal, huh? Do you think societies will eventually get motion sickness from all this upheaval, Simon?
Motion sickness seems pretty likely, Joe. With all these twists and turns in political landscapes, folks might just start yearning for a smoother ride, or they might buckle up and enjoy the thrill. It really begs the question, how long can this roller coaster keep going before everyone's craving a bit of good old stability? What do you think, Joe? What's next on this wild ride?
Oh, Simon, speaking of that crazy political roller coaster, imagine if we tossed in a bit of satire like an SNL skit. Picture this, a round table with our world's most charismatic populists, each trying to outdo the other in a policy pitch-off, but it's all subtle jabs and exaggerated promises. How do you think audiences react seeing their leaders portrayed with such biting humor? Could poking fun at politics actually help us deal with how bizarre things are getting?
Oh, man, Joe, that's just, spot on. Using humor like that, it's sort of a double-edged sword, don't you think? On one hand, sure, it makes this whole political circus a bit more palatable, sort of like sprinkling sugar on broccoli. People might tune in for a laugh, but they're also getting a spoonful of reality with their comedy, right? But then again, there's the flip side. Could all these laughs make folks take serious issues less seriously? Like if we're always cracking jokes, do we start seeing everything as a joke? Not everyone gets that it's satire. A few might just see it as plain old reality. What's your feel on that, Joe? Do you reckon satire is sharpening our political wit or kind of dulling the real impact of what's happening out there?
That's a really solid point, Simon. Satire does have that split effect. It can totally make critical issues more accessible and relatable, sparking conversations that might not happen in more formal settings, right? Like it's breaking down barriers to understanding complex policies with a chuckle or two. But you're spot on about the risks, too. If satire isn't done just right, there's a real chance it could trivialize issues, turning critical debates into punchlines. It's kind of like walking a tightrope. Comedians and satirists need to balance humor with respect for the gravity of issues. Do you think most comedians manage that balance well, or is it more hit and miss in your view, Simon?
Well, Joe, it's like swinging at a piñata while blindfolded. Sometimes you hit the sweet spot, and sometimes it's just air, right? I think a lot of comedians do manage to nail it, giving us that perfect mix of laugh-out-loud moments and thought-provoking insights. But then, there are times when the swing totally misses, and things either fall flat or worse, they offend. What's crucial, I guess, is how satire picks its targets. Like smart satire punches up, taking swings at those in power, rather than kicking downwards. And when it's done right, man, it can really shine a light on the absurdities of populism without making light of the people caught in the situation. What do you reckon, Joe? Do satirists have it harder these days, figuring out where that line is?
For those just tuning in, Simon and I have been chatting about satire in today's political climate, specifically focusing on how humorists sketch out these populism parodies. We're diving into whether these comical takes help us understand or maybe even deal with contemporary politics a bit better. So we've touched on the role of satire as this kind of double-edged sword, right? On one hand, it makes heavy political dramas a bit more digestible, turns them lighter, easier to engage with. But we also debated about, the flip side, like whether making jokes about serious stuff might lead people to take important issues less seriously. And crucial to our debate was this idea that effective satire should punch up, targeting those in power rather than punching down at others. It's all about hitting the sweet spot between being hilarious and staying respectful to the gravity of the topics, which isn't always easy, but man, when done right, it can really open our eyes to the absurdities of the world with a good laugh. So Simon, any final thoughts on where satirists might go next with their portrayals of global populism?
Oh, Joe, satirists are probably sharpening their pencils right now, ready to sketch out the next big gag. You know what would be wild? A reality show spoof featuring all these global leaders, kind of like Populist Island. Who gets voted off next? Now that'd keep everyone glued to their screens. What's the first challenge you think they should face on the island, Joe?
Ha, Populist Island, that's gold, Simon. First challenge? How about a truth-telling contest? No dodging questions, just the straight facts. Whoever strays from the truth gets a dunk in the lake of reality. Can you imagine the splash that would make?
Totally, Joe. Like, besides just being a hilarious dunk fest, this kind of challenge, let's call it Dunk the Dodger, right? It actually zooms in on, like, accountability. So satire isn't just, throwing pies for laughs. It's also about stripping down those pretenses and showing leaders can't just sidestep the truth without some consequences. And oh man, think about the reactions from the audience watching these leaders getting a literal splash of reality every time they twist the truth. It reminds people that, hey, even those big-time political figures have to face the music, or in this case, the lake. What do you reckon, Joe? Could something as wacky as Populist Island actually get some people to think more critically about the antics of our leaders?
Absolutely, Simon. Something as out there as Populist Island could definitely be a creative way to get people talking and thinking about the transparency and accountability of their leaders. It uses humor to mirror realities in a way that's both engaging and enlightening. Imagining these scenarios does make you wonder, what are other wild satire ideas could poke at politics while making us all ponder deeper truths?
Joe, these satirical bits got me thinking more seriously about the bigger picture stuff. Like if populism keeps on this path, right? What's that going to mean for democracy's health in the long haul? Could we see like a cycle where it keeps coming back in new forms, or does it kind of morph depending on where it's happening? This whole Populist Island bit is funny, but man, it does shine a spotlight on some potentially major shifts, huh? What's your take on where things might be heading?
Yeah, Simon, that's a really meaty question. Looking at populism and its trajectory, it seems like it could potentially keep morphing, adapting to local contexts and issues. But long term, could this undermine democratic foundations? Probably, yeah, in some places at least. Populism often relies on emotional appeals rather than detailed policy discussions, right? So you think about it, if these movements sideline institutions or overlook legal structures to push their agendas, that weakens checks and balances essential for healthy democracies. Now, whether there's a cycle or evolution, I guess it's a bit of both. Historically, populist waves do rise and recede, but each wave slightly changes the landscape depending on cultural or economic contexts. The tricky part is predicting how deep these changes go, or what they mean for personal freedoms, what civic engagement, all that important stuff. Could this be like a wake-up call for societies, pushing them to reevaluate and possibly reinforce their democratic systems? Or do we see a trend toward more autocratic styles under the guise of popular support? What's your sense on this, Simon? Do you think there's room to pivot back to more traditional democratic principles? Or are we watching a slow-motion shift to something else?
Joe, it's like walking a tightrope over a canyon, right? On one side, there's the chance these populist waves could shake people awake, make them rally to protect and strengthen their democratic muscles. But then, there's that risk of tipping too far, sliding into that authoritarian abyss with all its sparkly promises. It's this wild pendulum swing between awakening and apathy. Really makes you wonder which way the wind's gonna blow next. What do you think will tip the scales? Joe?
Totally, Simon. It's like the world's playing this massive game of Jenga with democracy, pulling out one populist block at a time. Could go high stakes very quickly. What'll tip the scales? Maybe it's how well we keep informed and involved. Active participation could be the kingpin here, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely, Joe. It's like keeping all your cards in play during a high-stakes poker game. Staying informed and involved is key, a sort of anchoring force in the midst of all this political shuffling. When people really dive into the issues, understand their impact, and, actually show up to vote or speak out, that's when you see democracy flex its muscles. Because, let's face it, unchecked populism could just bulldoze through the democratic norms we rely on, right? The more folks engage, the less likely they are to let passionate yet potentially misleading rhetoric steamroll the essential checks and balances needed for a healthy society. Man, imagining that future, where everyone steps up, not back, it gives some hope amid the chaos, huh? What's your feel, Joe? Do you think there are enough folks willing to tie themselves to the mast, so to say, and ride out these storms?
Honestly, Simon, I'm on the fence. It's like you want to have faith in people stepping up, right? But sometimes looking around, it feels shaky. There's a lot of noise, a ton of distractions. You got social media echo chambers making it tough for real balanced info to get through. So yeah, folks might want to tie themselves to that mast, but are they even seeing the storm or just snapshots filtered through whatever narrative they're sold? If we're diving into this future forecast, man, I think proactive education and communication, like really cutting through the noise, that's what could tip the scales back towards a robust democracy. Strategies need to be as dynamic as the populism we're facing. You think we're up for that challenge, or is it going to be more reacting too little too late, Simon?
Joe, that reminds me of this time I was hiking with a few friends in the Rockies. We got like caught up in this sudden storm, classic mountain weather, unpredictable as ever, right? There we were, barely any shelter, just trees for miles. And man, let me tell you, it was not the brochure's sunny picnic scene. Now, we knew the weather could turn, had apps and stuff, but we kind of ignored the signs, thought maybe it'd blow over. Classic case of wishful thinking. When it hit, though, we scrambled, found this little overhang, huddled there till things calmed down. It was like a real wake-up call about, actually paying attention to warnings. Kind of feels akin to what we're talking about, right? In societies today, all these signals flipping through our feeds might be warning us, readying us for a shift or a storm in how democracy functions with this rise in populism. But like my mountain mishap, are we taking these seriously? Brushing them off until the consequences are literally on top of us, forcing us into that uncomfortable cranny. This proactive education and stepping up, just like checking the weather properly next time, makes a difference between a great day out and, getting soaked in the rain. What do you think, Joe? Are we learning from past stumbles or just crossing our fingers and hoping for the best?
Man, Simon, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's like we're all in this wild movie, wondering if the characters will read the script or just improvise until the credits roll. It's kind of thrilling but nerve-wracking, huh? What's your bet? Do we learn and adapt, or are we just going to wing it until we can't anymore?
Joe, knowing us, we're probably going to improv our way into the next scene or stumble right onto the blooper reel. But hey, isn't that where all the best action happens? What's the next wild twist you're predicting, buddy?
Absolutely, Simon. Speaking of improvising, it's not just about us making choices. It's also about how those choices are shaped without us even realizing it. Like, take social media algorithms. They kind of script what we see online based on what we've liked before, right? It keeps feeding us views that amplify our own biases, like living in a bubble where everything echoes our opinion. How do you reckon this shapes our understanding of bigger issues, man?
Oh man, Joe, on the flip side, some folks argue those algorithms aren't all doom and gloom, right? Like they say having tailored content helps filter out the noise, making it easier to dive deep into stuff you're genuinely into. There's this idea, maybe a little optimistic, that if these tools are used mindfully, they can actually enhance learning. You get hyper-focused content delivery, which in theory, could boost awareness about specific topics faster than ever before. But here's the catch. It depends mega on the user leaning into diverse sources themselves, staying alert to the echo chamber effect. Because sure, these algorithms can narrow our vision, but hey, sometimes they might just lead us to discover a passion or even mobilize groups for a cause quickly and effectively. It swings both ways, huh?
Yeah, Simon, you've got a point about the perks, like focusing in on what lights your fire is crucial. But here's where I squint a bit, man. There's a massive downside when those same algorithms serve us a narrow slice of the pie, constantly confirming what we already think. Like dive deep. Sure, but what happens when you only dive in one spot? You miss out on the whole ocean of other perspectives, right? It feels like we're skating on thin ice here. It shapes society subtly, and not gonna lie, kind of worries me how that shapes our big decisions. What's needed might be a hack or something, huh? Something to punch holes in those bubbles occasionally to keep things fresh. Or maybe people taking it upon themselves to seek counter opinions actively. Tough balance to strike, though. What's your take, man? Possible to find that sweet spot?
Yeah, Joe, skating on thin ice is right. It's kind of like, having blinders on. We might be diving deep, but just in one spot, missing the whole ocean out there. Makes me wonder, how do we even start popping these algorithmic bubbles without turning everything upside down? And yeah, there's like got to be some balance, right? Maybe mixing up where we get our news or deliberately checking out different opinions. Um, that could kind of dilute the echo chamber effect, huh? Do you think folks are willing to make that leap, or are we too snug in our comfy bubble beds?
Yes, Simon. You're hitting it right on the nose, man. Stretching beyond our comfort zones, it's easier said than done, right? Like these algorithms, they're not just passive tools. They're active molders of perspective, heavily influencing what we consider to be the norm. And here's another layer. Like even when folks are kind of willing to step out of their bubbles, the platforms themselves with their nifty algorithms keep nudging us back in, serving content they think will keep us scrolling, not necessarily thinking broader or deeper. Real change? That might need double effort. Users actively seeking diversity in content and platforms, adjusting their algorithms to promote a wider variety of perspectives. It's like we've got to rebuild the machine while still running it. Challenging, but probably essential if we want to see real growth in how we consume and understand information, don't you think?
Man, Joe, imagine a world where every time you log in, your feed deliberately throws you a curveball, a totally unexpected viewpoint, just to spice things up. That'd keep us on our toes, huh? What wild ideas or perspectives might we stumble upon then?
Haha, yes, Simon, that'd be like throwing a wild card into the mix every now and then. But man, think about it. If our feeds did start slinging curveballs at us, wouldn't some folks just tune out? Like, say you're super into classical music and suddenly your feed blasts punk rock at you. Sure, it's fresh, but will you give it a chance or skip right past? Still, I kind of like the chaos of it, not gonna lie. It could really shake up how we think, expose us to wild new ideas that we might not have touched otherwise. But here's the kicker. Balance, right? Not just random blasts from left field, but maybe smarter nudges towards diverse content that's still somewhat aligned with our interests. Tricky to get right without feeling intrusive or annoying. Simon, do you think there's a way platforms can introduce this kind of diversity without folks feeling like their preferences are getting steamrolled?
Oh man, Joe, that's a tricky one. Like finding the balance between sparking curiosity and not outright jarring someone out of their comfort zone. It's like trying to sneak veggies into a kid's meal without them noticing, right? Maybe tweaking algorithms to gradually introduce new stuff, sort of easing us into it might work. Sort of like dipping your toes in the water, not just throwing you in. But how do we keep it natural, Not making folks feel like they're being forced to eat their digital vegetables. How do platforms make that shift smoothly but effectively, keeping everyone's tastes in mind without crossing that line into feeling, I don't know, manipulated or something? What do you think, Joe? Is there a sweet spot there somewhere?
Yeah, Simon, diving deeper into that, The key might really be in transparency and user control. Like if folks knew how algorithms worked, kind of demystifying the whole process, and had some say in it, they might be more open to exploring beyond their usual feeds. Platforms could offer settings where users tweak how much new or opposing content they want sprinkled into their daily digital diet. It's kind of like choosing the level of spice in your meal. Not everyone wants the extra hot sauce, but some might crave a little kick to keep things interesting. Introducing these options can make transitions smoother and less forced, giving people the feeling that they're driving, not just along for the ride. Platforms have a big role in sketching these blueprints so that curiosity wins over comfort without making folks feel like they're losing their familiar online neighborhood. What do you reckon? Does that approach hit closer to that sweet spot you're talking about?
Spot on, Joe. It's like letting everyone pick their own adventure in the digital world. Man, imagine the stories we'd hear then. What wild online journey would you embark on first if you had that kind of control?
Totally, Simon. Speaking of picking our digital adventures, it's wild to think how the seeds were planted for today's media landscape long ago, huh? From those early broadsheets pushing hardcore party lines right through to our modern digital platforms, it's been quite the journey. These roots from partisan broadsheets, back when newspapers were basically the mouthpieces of political factions, they've kind of mapped out the path to today's echo chambers. What's your take on how these historical methods are shaping our current media situation?
Yeah, Joe, you're digging into some deep history there. It's fascinating to see how not much has changed at the core, huh? Those broadsheets were pretty blunt tools, just smashing people over the head with party views. Makes you think, right? But here's my 2 cents. Even though today's media is way more complex technologically, we're still dealing with the same old echoes of those partisan roots. It's like no matter how fancy our tech gets, we're playing the same broken record. Maybe the real question is why we keep sticking to that script instead of writing a new one, right? Are we just comfy in our well-worn grooves, or is there something else keeping us there? What do you think? Are we stuck in this loop forever, or is there a way out?
Spot on again, Simon. Those age-old grooves sure are deep. It's like we're stuck on repeat instead of shuffle, huh? Anyway, man, hard to say if there's a way out, but chatting about it like this is definitely a start. All right, folks, that's all the time we've got today. Thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure you come back tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern for another round of deep dives and wild rides with us here on Infinite Podcast. Catch you then.